So I pray that as we now begin and enter into this season of Advent, that we would be reminded and formed and shaped in the way of Jesus. That's our prayer as we enter this season. That's why we observe the seasons, that we can learn more about the story of Jesus, and that we might be invited to enter into the very story of Jesus. And so our theme for Advent this year, as you see behind me, is Thy Kingdom Come. Now, if you were to Google images of a kingdom, this is not the image that would perhaps pop up. You're going to see castles with large gates and walls and a moat and an army, and all of these things might come up when you think kingdom, and yet we're going to see today and throughout this series, and really throughout the whole of the calendar, that God's kingdom is, in fact, quite different. That His kingdom is more well represented by this lowly barn or stable or shed that we see here, and this is very similar, eerily similar to the type of birth that Jesus was experienced as He was born in Bethlehem in a stable. There was no room for them in the inn, and we'll get to that as we get closer and closer to Christmas. We're looking at God's kingdom that's quite different, lowly and humble, that it might shape us and teach us how we might be the same. And so through this season, this series of Advent, we're going to be looking at the prophet Isaiah. Definitely one of my favorite of all the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah. You can call him the Christmas prophet, if you will. He has a majority of his prophecies of hope that are leaning towards the Messiah to come. A hope that is needed, we can't quite figure out yet. Isaiah lived about 700 years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He lived in a time of great turmoil of God's people. God's people had become their own nation. They had a few kings already. They had King Saul and then King David and then King Solomon. And after Solomon came, at the height of what you would think God's kingdom would be, it fell apart. They began to value the wrong things, and there was a split in God's people. They had the northern kingdom of Israel with 2 of the tribes of Jacob. And then you had the southern king of Judah. The northern king's capital was Samaria, and the southern king's capital was Jerusalem, the great city of peace, Jerusalem. Yet it didn't quite live up to its name. Isaiah lived in this time when the great Assyrian army came in and swept through the land, killing many, exiling many, deporting many from the northern kingdom of Israel. And now the southern kingdom was left shaking in their boots, if you will. Scared, nervous, wondering when and if they're going to be next from this mighty army. And Isaiah, in the middle of this time of turmoil and unrest, writes many of his poems from the book of Isaiah. And so we're going to be looking through the book of Isaiah all throughout Advent. And what I love for us, these aren't scriptures that I went in myself and picked out. These are ones that are actually handed to us through the lectionary. And you've heard me talk about the lectionary a time or two. This is a group of church people around the world that have put together this series of scriptures where every Sunday there's an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, a psalm, and a gospel reading. We heard our psalm reading earlier from John, Psalm 122. And these 4 weeks of these passages from Isaiah are not some that I've picked out on my own, but rather some that are handed to me, therefore handed to us. And so I'm excited to jump into what Isaiah has to say to us today. As John mentioned before, our 4 themes throughout the weeks of Advent, Advent is 4 weeks, is represented by the 4 candles. The first being hope, which is today. Next week will be peace. And then joy. Joy is represented by the pink candle, the joyful candle. And then finally, week 4 will be love. And so today we're talking about hope. Hope is something that is quite mysterious. It's something you can't really manifest in and of yourself. Hope, especially if you feel like you've lost your way. If you feel like there's a time of turmoil in your life, maybe you feel as though you can't quite see the light at the end of the tunnel. Hope is a powerful thing that we can't quite make on our own. Has there been a time in your life when you felt hopeless? I can think for me, and I've shared this before, when I graduated high school and went off to college with hopes of going into the ministry and becoming a pastor or a preacher or doing something like that. And then I went to college and screwed up, failed out, had to move home with great shame. I was a bum. I was a loser. I didn't fit in. I stayed up too late with friends. I slept in too late. And this pattern of my life went on for a few years. I would work an odd job here, and then I'd quit. I'd go back to school and take a few classes, and then I'd quit, or I'd drop out, or I'd fail out, or I had this pattern, this rut that I couldn't seem to get out of. And for me, it was this season of hopelessness. I thought that the Lord was going to prepare me and lead me to be a pastor of a church, but yet I had long since given up on that dream. Surely there's no way I could do that. I couldn't even finish school. I couldn't get my life together. I couldn't get on track. I was stuck. I was spinning my wheels. It was a time, certainly as I look back, but even as I experienced it at the time, a time of hopelessness. Maybe you felt hopeless throughout a season of your life you think back to. A season of struggle, maybe financially, a season of addiction or a problem with a certain sin of drugs and alcohol or pornography. There was a season of struggle, of hopelessness that you felt. Maybe it's been a season of loss. Maybe you've lost your job. Maybe you've lost even a loved one. We've all, if we're honest, in the last few years been through a rather difficult season. And we've experienced it in different ways, but this pandemic, this COVID season that we've had, we've perhaps lost a lot of things. I know people that have lost jobs and people that have lost loved ones. And there could very well be a sense of hopelessness as we look around. Maybe for you, you look around to the world, the landscape right now, and you have a sense of hopelessness. Maybe whatever side you're on, right, left or right, which I talk about often politically, whether your side's in charge right now or was in charge but not in charge right now, you feel hopeful or hopeless depending on, right, what side you might lean to. But you look around and you see moral decay, you see questions are abounding, you're not sure what society is doing, and maybe you feel hopeless right now. Isaiah wrote these words that we're going to look at today in quite a similar time of hopelessness. The Assyrian army had wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel. The Babylonian army had then overtaken the Assyrians, and now the Babylonians, with great King Nebuchadnezzar, were pressing down on Jerusalem, on the nation of Judah. And Isaiah, in this time of fear, God's people needed a word of hope. And I believe the word of hope that he writes to them, he writes to us in the same way. And so I want us to look at the words that Isaiah writes. Isaiah chapter 2, the very beginning of his book. We're going to look at verses 1 through 5 today. Isaiah writes, "The word that Isaiah son of Amoz saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." Hope. Isaiah writes these words of hope some 700 years before the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. Hope is something that we need. Hope is something that we can't manifest in of ourselves, but God can bring us a word of hope through this prophet Isaiah that he wrote many, many, many years ago. Isaiah has a word of hope for us, and he speaks of something he doesn't fully understand yet, but he believes that in the latter days there will be a time to come, as he prophesies of a Messiah, when these truths will be true for us. When these truths will be a reality for us. He says in verse number 1, the word that Isaiah the son of Amoz, we don't know much about Isaiah's father Amoz other than that was his name. He says, but he saw these words concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Like I said, this is a time of great literal fear for God's people. Judah, the southern kingdom, with its capital Jerusalem. So this is the context Isaiah is living in as they're waiting, anticipating, fearing the army, right, from the north, from the east. The Babylonians. The great, powerful, mighty army that's more than likely the strongest on the earth at the time. And then you had God's people, this little group, this little nation. And they were fearful. They were literally fearful. And Isaiah understands the circumstances going on, and he feels the word from the Lord to bring this message of hope to speak to a very real problem that's going on in our lives. And I believe that as the church today, as we seek to be the mouthpieces of God the same way that the prophets were in the Old Testament, as we seek to represent Jesus, I believe there's an important thing we can learn before we dive too far into our scripture from Isaiah. You see, the prophets would not just be these fluffy, spiritual, talking only people. Or, hey, I know we got real world problems over here, but we're just going to kind of hang over here and talk spiritual fluff. And I think a lot of times maybe the church gets caught up in the same temptation. The church, I just want my church to just kind of not get into the real world stuff, but let me just hang back and talk spiritual fluff. I say fluff because I don't know a better word to use. Let me just remain over here and talk spiritual, but we don't need to get into the real world things, because if we get into the real world things, well, now that means the church is getting political. And there's that word, political. And for far too long, the church has remained silent on real world, you may call it political, but real world issues, real world problems. Isaiah takes a step in to address the very real world problem they faced and the very literal army that was bearing down on them. The church, I believe, is called to address very real world problems. But what has happened in the meantime is that the church has been tempted and fallen susceptible to just join aside if they're going to address political things. So you have conservative Republican churches, which they wouldn't call themselves that, but if you aren't that, you wouldn't quite fit in very well. Or you have liberal progressive churches where they wouldn't call themselves that, but if you weren't that, you wouldn't fit in quite well. And the churches believe, well, if we're going to be relevant and talk about real world things, we're going to have to pick one of these worldviews to join in, and we've got it all wrong. The church should be a voice from elsewhere. It's a voice from God. It's the way of His kingdom. See, I believe the church should be political, but political in a way that we don't think. I believe God's kingdom is political. And when I say political, it's how we view and how we run the world. God very much cares about how the world runs. So the church, when it remains absent or when it picks a side, does a disservice to the very true reality of God's kingdom that is present for us. We are to be a voice representing God's kingdom here and now, today. That Jesus is King of kings and Lord of lords. And that we don't have to stay absent. We don't have to pull back and let's just talk spiritual fluff over here and never address real world things. No, real world needs real help. And God provides real help through His Son, Jesus. We need to be a church that's not afraid to speak on things that are real world. And so most Sundays, there's times where I'll step on a toe over here on this side, and then I'll step on a toe over here on this side. All the while, we need to be reminded that God's way, God's kingdom, is very much a real opportunity, a real option. You might say it this way: instead of the kingdom of God, maybe you can say the politics of God, just to make it nice and controversial. This is the way that God desires the world to run. And the church should not be afraid to speak into the realities of these truths. Isaiah writes this in verse number 2. It shall come to pass, he says, in the latter days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that He may teach us His ways, and that we may walk in His paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Isaiah writes this to say, hey, there will be a time in the latter days, we're going to talk about that in a moment. There will be a time that comes when all the people, all the nations, and this means even the Gentiles, right now God's people were just the Jewish people, just this one nation. It was them against the world. And then there's this prophecy from Isaiah that says there will be a time that comes when all the nations, even the Gentile nations, will come to flow to the nation, to the mountain of the Lord. That God will be the highest of peaks. No philosophy or ideology or other gods or goddesses, none will reach to the highest point that is our God, Yahweh. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of these people in the Old Testament. The God of the Jewish nation. This kingdom of Judah with its capital Jerusalem, who were living in fear. Isaiah says there will be a time that comes when all the nations will come to understand and seek out the wisdom of our God. Now maybe for us this doesn't seem like that big of a claim. I would say that, right, God, and in fact now Jesus, as he makes God known, is quite famous. Jesus might very well be the most famous name in all of the world. You could argue that. Now not everybody loves and worships him, certainly, but Jesus Christ, that name is perhaps the most famous name in all of the world. Yet, in this time, 650 years before Jesus was even born in Bethlehem, that was not the case. God's people were not weird because they worshiped God. They were weird because they only worshiped one God. I've said this many times. All the other nations had their own spiritual systems, their own gods and goddesses. They would have looked down upon Israel as this just puny, small, insignificant nation. They didn't stand a chance against the others, and their God was just this one God. Like, what's he going to do? We have many mighty other gods and goddesses. And so when Isaiah says all of the world, all of the nations will come, this was a quite far-fetched idea. See, God's people was just this small group, this one little nation with one little God, or so they thought. He says, but there will be a time when they come to worship God. When they will flow, it says, instead of down, it says they'll flow up to the mountain, the highest peak, that is who God is. That all will come. That all will seek to worship. And even says that from this place, from Zion, from God's people, from Jerusalem, it says from here, outward will go the word. Outward will go the law. Outward into the nations. Which is a reminder for us that when God comes to be with us and bless us as a people, it's not just something that we want to keep to ourselves. Like, let's just all huddle up together and keep this here with just for us. No, it's meant to be shared. It's meant to be sent out. This helps fulfill the ongoing prophecy that God spoke to Abraham way back in Genesis 12. Right, God came and made a covenant with his people, beginning with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons of Jacob, and all the way down the line of God's family becoming the nation of Israel. But he starts with Abraham in Genesis, and in chapter 12, verse 3, he tells him that, hey, I'm going to bless you and bless your family, but not just that, but so that your family can be a blessing to the others. Your family can be a blessing to the other nations. That all the other people in the world might be blessed through your family. See, when we receive a blessing from God, it's not just supposed to be for us. It's supposed to go through us, that we might be a blessing to someone else. And in the same way here, Isaiah says there'll be a time where all will come to seek the wisdom of God, the highest point of understanding that God will be God amongst all the other gods. He will rise above all of the others. And that the wisdom that we have of God, that we will be sent out to share with them, to encourage them, to be present with them, that it's not something we hold to ourselves. We don't just hold the blessing of God to ourselves. No, we share it. And so what is this blessing? What is this wisdom of God? It says they come to seek out his paths. What is this path of God? Verse 4. Isaiah writes, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. I believe that hope is the end of war. I believe that hope is the very end of violence and the ways of war. This very literal hope that Isaiah writes. You see, we lost our hope when we went back and reverted to not the way God created us. See, I've said this before. God creates humanity that we might be, right, partners in ruling the world with God. Not apart from God, but in partnership with God. He says the humanity, that we will rule, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, the plants of the ground. God says that we will have dominion over them and that we are to rule them. And that God's good earth that he has created will provide everything that we need. And yet, humanity chose the wrong path. Way back in the book of Genesis, early on, chapter 3, they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And maybe you've wrestled with understanding this story. This is humanity now deciding, okay, now I know what's good and bad, right and wrong for myself. I don't need God. And so two paths opened up. And rather than walking the pathway that God had for them, humanity now begins to walk the pathway that they've chosen. Where essentially we are our own God. We know what's right and wrong. We know what's good and evil ourselves. And as we spread, what we had one time was tools for gardening and for farming that we might cultivate life and food and health and share that with the people that are around us. Rather, over time, we traded these in. We traded these farming tools in for swords, spears. We no longer needed these gardening tools for cultivating life. Now we need a sword and a spear to protect ourselves or to fight against the other humans that we were meant to live in harmony with. The picture of Eden in Genesis 2 and the picture of Revelation, the new heaven and earth in Revelation 21 and 22, that we would live in harmony and peace with those that are around us. That as humanity that God placed upon the earth, that we would understand that all that we need, God provides for us through the very earth that He has created for us. And yet rather over time we found something wrong with our brother, wrong with our sister, wrong with our neighbor, and we now fight against them. They don't look like me, they don't think like me, they don't vote like me, they are a different skin color than me, they are a different nation than me, and we've divided ourselves and traded in these gardening tools, these farming tools, for swords and spears. And Isaiah writes, there'll be a time that comes in these latter days when nations shall beat their swords into plowshares. Plowshare is a tool for farming. When they shall beat their spears into pruning hooks. Used at a vineyard, a pruning hook. Essentially, he says there will be a time that comes when we can trade in our instruments of death for instruments of life. Instruments of death, swords and spears, created for the purpose of fighting and killing. We'll turn those in for instruments of life, of gardening and farming and cultivating food and inviting people into our table. Isaiah presents this very real, this very literal hope of a time when we will not study and learn and follow the ways of war. And when does he say this to his people? During a time of war. During a time when they're literally fearful of the swords and spears coming their way. And he says, there will be a time. Hope is coming. So, what are these latter days? When are these latter days? You know, the early church believed that the latter days began with Jesus. Did you know that we're living in the latter days right now? Did you know that we're living in the end times right now? You know that we're living in the last days right now? I don't say this to scare you or to stoke fear. No, this is just the truth of the age that we live in. This is the age of the church. Following Jesus is the last days. And so right now you may feel like, oh, this is the end of the world. This is the end of time. This is the end of the days. And you know who else just thought that? Every other generation, all the way back to Jesus. Even the very people, the first generation, thought they were the very end of days, and they quit their jobs and just sat up on the roof and waited for Jesus to come back. And Paul had to say, guys, y'all go get jobs. You got to eat, you got to provide, you got to get a job and pay for the food for your table. We are living in the last days. We are living in the latter days. The church age is these latter days that Isaiah prophesied. It comes with Jesus Christ as King and Lord. And so these very first Christians, the first few centuries, really when you talk about the early church, it's the first 300 years of the church. And this is up until the time Constantine comes in to corrupt the church in a way to make it more of an empire, a Christendom, and this is not the way, the path that Jesus laid out. But the first 300 years of the church, these Christians believed these words of Isaiah. They believed they were living in these days. They weren't waiting for them. They weren't hoping that maybe one day. No, they believed they were living in these days now. And this is why the very first Christians, they didn't sign up for the military. They didn't fight in wars. And now, for you here today, if you're in the military or fought in a war before, I'm not here to critique you and judge you, and I'd be happy to talk about this with you after the service. Let me know on your Connect card, please. But what I do know is that these first 300 years of the church, these early Christians, the first ones, they believed, hey, we're not supposed to wage war. We're not supposed to pick up a sword. We're going to lay it down. We're not supposed to have a spear. We're going to beat it into a pruning hook, a plowshare. And so the church spread rapidly through the Roman Empire, the mighty Roman Empire. Not through war. Not through fighting. Yet this was the way throughout the history of humanity that movements and religious ideologies had spread through the fighting and waging of war. And yet this new movement followed this Messiah who didn't fight, who didn't wage war. Jesus, who didn't raise up a sword to fight his enemy, but rather laid his sword down and told his disciples to do the same. That instead of killing his enemies, he died upon the cross for them, forgiving them as they did it. And then he asked us, his followers, the church, that we might do the same. That we might follow his footsteps. And so the church continues this way that Isaiah prophesied about. We are living in these days now. We are living in these days today. We get to be the people that long for the fulfillment of these days to come at the second coming of Christ, but we live into the present reality of them now. I have good news for you today. I have a message of hope for you today, and it's that Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords now, today. Not just something that we have to wait for, right? We don't just say, well, we're gonna run the world how we think the world ought to be run now, and Jesus, you can be in charge later on, like in the afterlife time, or when you come back again. But for now, we got to run the world, and we got to pick one of these sides that we're on, and this is how the world should run. No, Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords now. And we as his followers get to live in this reality, in this truth. As the message that Isaiah prophesied would go out from Jerusalem, when did this happen? When was this fulfilled? This is happening in the church. The church fulfills this age. This is the time that we live in. In the book of Acts, when the apostles came together and waited in the upper room after Jesus had been crucified and then resurrected and then ascended back to the Father, they wait on the coming of the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit comes upon them, and then they come to Jerusalem, the very city Isaiah talked about. Jerusalem. And then the message of Christ goes out from there. This is the fulfillment of the prophecy. It's not something that we're just living in, waiting on. We are not in the same boat as Isaiah, waiting on the coming of the Messiah. No, we are living on the other side. The Messiah has come. Jesus has come. He is King. He has brought about the latter days, and these are the days that we live in. The age of the church. Where we don't have to spread as a church through violent means. We don't pick up our swords and our spears to fight that we might move our agenda further. No, we lay them down that we might submit and love one another, even forgiving and loving our enemies. This radical way that just doesn't make sense, yet it is the way of God. It is the path of Jesus. And so the hope that we talk about today, the good news that we bring forth on this first Sunday of Advent, I don't have a 3-step process to find hope. I believe hope is that Jesus is King of Kings now. Hope is that Jesus comes to fulfill this prophecy of Isaiah, that we are living in these days today. That we don't have to just sit back and wait and hope that maybe one day things will be made right, but for now, like, we're out of luck. No, what we get to do as the church is we are the messengers of hope. We are the one who brings the good news to those around the world, to those in our path, to those that live next door and that we work in the cubicle next to. We are the ones that get to bring this hope, this good news to them. That Jesus has come, that Jesus is King, and that we're living in a time where we don't have to spread our message, our agenda by fighting. This is how the church is spread. We get to fulfill this together. And so the message of hope for us today, I pray, would be that we look to Jesus. Isaiah concludes in verse number 5 in saying this, O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Jesus will go on to say of himself that he is the light of the world. John the Apostle would write in the first book of his gospel, the book of John, he said that Jesus is the light amongst the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. Jesus is this light that Isaiah is prophesying about. Jesus is this hope. Jesus is this bringer of the latter days. Jesus is the launch pad of the church into the world, the age in which we live today. And the hope that we have is that Jesus has done this, that he is present with us, and that we can live into the reality of his kingdom now. We don't have to wait. Might we as the church walk in the light that is the Lord. May he teach us the way to walk. May our lives look different than those that are around us, swayed by every other ideology of the world, but rather may we stay faithful to Jesus and his paths. I believe Jesus is our example. Jesus is our hope.